Elena's hands trembled as she pressed her ear against the cold wood of the study door. Inside, her stepmother's voice cut through the air like a blade. "She will not attend the ball. I have already decided this. Clara and Violet will go, and Elena will remain here, where she belongs." Elena stepped back from the door, her heart pounding. The invitation had arrived that morning, sealed with the crest of the Duke of Ashworth himself, and for one brief moment she had allowed herself to hope. That hope was already dying. She walked quietly down the corridor of the house that had once been her father's pride. The portraits on the walls still showed him smiling, his eyes warm, his hand resting on her small shoulder in a painting made when she was only 7 years old. Now the house felt like a stranger's home, filled with furniture Margaret had chosen and rules Margaret had made. Elena's mother had died when she was a child, and for years it had only been her and her father. He had taught her to read by candlelight, to ride a horse with confidence, to speak her mind even when others wished her silent. When he married Margaret 3 years ago, Elena had tried to welcome her, tried to welcome Clara and Violet as sisters. She had wanted a family again. Instead, she had become a servant in her own home. Her father died suddenly the following year, and everything changed overnight. Margaret took control of the estate, claiming debts that Elena had never heard mentioned while her father was alive. The fine dresses were given to Clara and Violet. The best rooms were reassigned. Elena found herself sleeping in a small chamber near the kitchens, rising before dawn to help with tasks a lady of her birth should never have needed to perform. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself that her father's love for her had been real, and no amount of cruelty from Margaret could erase that truth. But some nights, alone in the dark, she allowed herself to weep quietly into her pillow, wondering if she would spend the rest of her life invisible. "You heard, didn't you?" Elena turned to find Nora standing behind her, a folded cloth in her weathered hands. Nora had served the family since before Elena was born, and she was the only person left in the house who still looked at Elena the way her father once had, with warmth instead of judgment. "I heard," Elena said softly. "It does not matter. I was foolish to hope." "It is not foolish to hope," Nora said firmly. "It is foolish to give up. Come with me." Elena followed Nora up the narrow servant staircase to a small storage room at the top of the house. Inside, beneath a dust sheet hung a gown Elena had never seen before. It was pale blue, simple in its design, but elegant, with delicate embroidery along the sleeves. "This was your mother's," Nora said. "I kept it hidden after she passed. I always hoped there would be a reason to bring it out again." Elena reached out and touched the fabric, feeling tears sting her eyes. "Nora, I cannot. If Margaret discovers this—" "Margaret will discover many things eventually," Nora said. "But tonight, you are going to that ball. Your father would have wanted it. You are his daughter, and no one, not even Margaret, has the right to keep you locked away forever." Elena hesitated, fear and longing warring inside her chest. She thought of her father's voice, steady and encouraging, telling her to stand tall even when the world tried to make her small. She thought of the years she had spent quietly obeying, quietly disappearing, quietly becoming smaller and smaller until she wondered if anyone would notice if she vanished completely. Something inside her shifted. "Help me," she said. "Please." Nora smiled and began preparing the gown. As the afternoon light faded into evening, Elena stood before a small mirror, watching a version of herself she barely recognized emerge. Her chestnut hair was swept back with simple pins, a few soft curls framing her face. The blue gown fit as though it had been made for her, though it had belonged to her mother years before. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena saw not a servant, not a burden, but a young woman with her father's strength in her eyes. "You look like her," Nora whispered. "Just like your mother." Margaret's carriage had already departed with Clara and Violet, both dressed in gowns far grander than anything Elena owned, both chattering eagerly about the Duke and the fortune and title that awaited whichever young woman managed to catch his attention. Elena had no carriage of her own, no escort, no invitation of protection should Margaret discover her there. "There is an old carriage in the back stable," Nora said. "It belonged to your father. No one uses it now, but it still runs. I will find you a driver." "Nora, if Margaret finds out you helped me—" "Let me worry about Margaret," Nora said, her chin lifting with quiet defiance. "You worry about tonight. Go and remember who you are, Elena, not who she has tried to make you." The ride to Ashworth Hall took nearly an hour, winding through dark countryside lit only by scattered lanterns and the pale glow of a rising moon. Elena's stomach twisted with nerves the entire way, doubt creeping in with every passing mile. What if Margaret saw her? What if she was turned away at the door for arriving without a proper invitation in hand, since Margaret had hidden the sealed paper away that morning? What if the entire night ended in humiliation before it had even begun? But beneath the fear was something else, something she had not felt in a very long time. Anticipation, hope, a quiet, stubborn belief that perhaps tonight could be different. When the carriage finally slowed before the grand entrance of Ashworth Hall, Elena's breath caught in her throat. The house rose before her like something from a dream, its windows glowing gold with candlelight, music and laughter drifting out into the night air. Carriages lined the drive, footmen moving briskly to assist arriving guests, and beyond the open doors she could see the flicker of movement, color, and light. She stepped down from the carriage on unsteady legs, smoothing the fabric of her gown with trembling fingers. A young footman approached to ask for her invitation, and for one terrible moment Elena's mind went blank with panic. "I am Elena Whitmore," she said, lifting her chin the way her father had taught her. "My family's invitation was sent this morning. I apologize for the confusion, but I assure you I am expected." The footman studied her for a long moment before glancing at his list. Whether by luck or by the quiet confidence in her voice, he nodded and stepped aside to let her pass. Elena walked through the grand doors of Ashworth Hall, and the world she had known for the past 3 years seemed to fall away behind her. Ahead lay music, candlelight, and a night that would change everything, though she did not yet know how much. She thought back to the years before her father's death, when this kind of gathering would have felt natural to her, when she had been trained since childhood in the steps of every dance, the proper way to greet a duchess, the careful art of conversation that filled rooms like this one. Her father had always told her that true worth was never measured by a title or a fortune, but by the strength of one's character under pressure. She had not understood the weight of those words until she had spent 3 years being told, in 100 small and cruel ways, that she was worth nothing at all. A servant passed carrying a tray of drinks, and Elena took one gratefully, if only to give her hands something to do. She glanced around the room, searching without meaning to for a friendly face, and found none. She recognized a few families from her childhood, faces that had once smiled warmly at her father's table, now turned away in polite indifference, as though the years of her absence had erased her from memory entirely. It stung more than she expected. She had told herself she no longer cared what society thought of her, that she had made peace with her diminished place in the world. Standing here now, surrounded by the glittering proof of a life she had lost, she realized how much of a lie that had been. Still, she did not leave. She straightened her shoulders and reminded herself why she had come, not to be noticed, not to be admired, simply to reclaim, for one single night, a piece of the life that had once belonged to her, before Margaret's careful cruelty had convinced her she deserved nothing more than shadows and silence. Across the ballroom, near a tall window overlooking the moonlit gardens, Margaret stood in conversation with several other mothers, her eyes sweeping the crowd with calculating precision. Clara and Violet stood nearby, both eager, both watching the door for any sign of the Duke's arrival. None of them had noticed Elena yet, tucked as she was near the edge of the room, but Elena knew it was only a matter of time before Margaret's sharp gaze found her. She had perhaps an hour, maybe less, before her stepmother realized she was there. An hour to simply exist in this world she had once belonged to, before the confrontation she knew was coming arrived to shatter it. Somewhere in that glittering crowd, Margaret stood with Clara and Violet at her side, unaware that the stepdaughter she had tried so hard to erase had just walked through the door. And somewhere among the guests, though Elena did not know it yet, stood a man whose life was about to change course entirely, simply because of the moment their eyes would soon meet. Elena drew in a steadying breath and stepped further into the ballroom, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. Whatever happened tonight, she told herself, at least she had come. At least, for one night, she had chosen herself. The chandeliers above sparkled like captured stars, and beneath them, hundreds of guests moved in swirls of silk and laughter. Elena had never seen anything so beautiful, nor so intimidating. She kept close to the edges of the room, unwilling to draw attention, watching as couples danced and conversations rose and fell like waves. She did not yet know that fate had already set its course, and that before the night ended, everything she believed about her place in the world would be tested in front of everyone who had ever doubted her. The music shifted into a lively waltz, and the crowd around Elena began to move toward the center of the floor. She stayed near the wall, watching the swirl of gowns and candlelight, allowing herself, just for a moment, to forget the life waiting for her outside these doors. Then she heard it. A voice, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the pleasant hum of conversation like a blade through silk. "Elena?" She turned to find Margaret standing only a few feet away, her face pale with fury beneath the careful composure she wore in public. Clara and Violet stood behind her, both wide-eyed with shock, and several nearby guests had already begun to turn, drawn by the sudden tension in Margaret's voice. "What?" Margaret said slowly, each word deliberate and cold. "Do you think you are doing here?" Elena's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain steady, remembering her father's voice in her mind, urging her to stand tall. "I received an invitation, the same as you. I am here as a guest, just as you are." "You received nothing," Margaret hissed, stepping closer, lowering her voice, though it did little to hide the venom in her tone. "This is not your world anymore, Elena. You do not belong here, dressed in stolen clothing, pretending to be something you are not." Several heads turned at the word stolen. Elena felt her face flush with heat, humiliation crawling up her spine as more guests began to notice the confrontation unfolding near the edge of the dance floor. "This gown belonged to my mother," Elena said quietly, though her voice trembled. "It is not stolen. Nothing about tonight is stolen." But Margaret was no longer interested in quiet reason. She had an audience now, and she intended to use it. "Everyone," she said, raising her voice just enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. "Forgive my stepdaughter's confusion. She has always struggled to understand her place. I am afraid grief has made her forget herself entirely, wandering into gatherings uninvited, wearing gowns that do not belong to her." Laughter rippled through a small cluster of guests nearby, cruel and quiet, the kind of laughter that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. Elena felt the room tilt slightly beneath her feet, felt every eye she could sense turning toward her, judging, whispering, deciding in an instant who she was and what she deserved. "I think," Margaret continued, clearly enjoying the growing attention, "it is best if you leave before you embarrass yourself further, Elena. This is a night for respectable young women, not for those who sneak into places they were never meant to be." Elena opened her mouth to respond, though she was not entirely certain what words might come, when a low, steady voice spoke from just behind her shoulder. "Is there a problem here?" The crowd around them seemed to shift instantly, a ripple of recognition and quiet awe passing through the guests as they realized who had approached. Elena turned, and found herself looking up into the calm, composed face of a man she instantly recognized from the portrait hanging in the entrance hall. Duke Nathaniel of Ashworth. He was tall, with dark hair swept back neatly, and eyes the color of a stormy sea, sharp and observant, though not unkind. He wore his authority the way some men wore their coats, comfortably, without needing to announce it. His gaze moved from Margaret's flustered expression to Elena's pale, humiliated face, and something in his eyes shifted, though Elena could not yet tell what it meant. Margaret recovered quickly, dropping into an elegant curtsy, her voice smooth once more. "Your Grace, forgive the disturbance. My stepdaughter arrived uninvited, and I was simply explaining that she should return home." Nathaniel's eyes remained on Elena for a long moment before he spoke. "Uninvited, you say? Strange, considering every family on my guest list received an invitation extended to the entire household, without exception." He turned toward Margaret, his tone polite but firm. "Are you suggesting my invitation was not properly delivered to every member of your family?" Margaret's confident expression faltered, just slightly. "Your Grace, I understand perfectly what you meant," Nathaniel said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that silenced the surrounding whispers entirely. He turned fully toward Elena then, extending his hand with quiet certainty. "Might I have this dance?" For a moment, Elena could not move. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath around her, dozens of eyes fixed on the unfolding scene, waiting to see what she would do. She glanced at Margaret, whose face had gone rigid with barely restrained fury, then back to the Duke, whose expression remained patient, steady, and sincere. She placed her hand in his. The moment their fingers touched, a hush fell over the nearest guests, followed almost immediately by a wave of murmured astonishment as Nathaniel led her onto the dance floor, leaving Margaret standing frozen beside her daughters, humiliation now painted clearly across her own face instead. The orchestra began a new waltz, and Nathaniel guided Elena through the steps with practiced ease. She followed hesitantly at first, her mind still spinning from the sudden reversal of fortune, but gradually, as the music swelled around them, she allowed herself to relax into the rhythm. "You did not have to do that," Elena said softly, once they had moved far enough from Margaret's furious gaze. "I am aware," Nathaniel replied, a faint, almost amused smile touching his lips. "I chose to anyway." "Why?" He considered the question seriously. his sharp eyes studying her face as though searching for something specific. Because cruelty dressed up in fine manners is still cruelty. And because you did not flinch, even when the entire room turned against you. That is not something I see often in this world. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, though this time it had nothing to do with shame. You do not know me, Your Grace. No, he admitted. But I intend to remedy that. They danced through the remainder of the waltz in comfortable silence, broken only by occasional quiet conversation. Elena learned that Nathaniel had inherited the dukedom young, after his own father's sudden passing, and had spent the years since learning to navigate a world of politics and expectation that he had never truly wanted. There was a weariness beneath his composed exterior, something guarded and careful, though Elena sensed it came from experience rather than coldness. When the music finally ended, Nathaniel did not release her hand immediately. Instead, he guided her toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the curious stares that still lingered on them both. Your stepmother, he said carefully, seems to hold a great deal of resentment toward you. Elena hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal to a stranger, even one who had just defended her so publicly. It is a long story, Your Grace. I have patience, he said simply, and I find myself curious. Before Elena could decide how to respond, a familiar voice interrupted them once more. Elena. Margaret's tone had changed entirely, now sweet and falsely warm, clearly performing for the benefit of the Duke's attention. I do hope there are no hard feelings. A misunderstanding, nothing more. Perhaps you should retire early, dear. You must be terribly tired after such an eventful evening. Elena recognized the threat hidden beneath the honeyed words immediately. This was Margaret's attempt to remove her before any further damage could be done to her carefully constructed reputation. I am quite well, thank you, Elena said evenly, refusing to be so easily dismissed. Margaret's smile tightened at the edges, though she said nothing further, clearly unwilling to risk another scene in front of the Duke. She retreated instead, gathering Clara and Violet with a sharp glance, though not before casting one final, venomous look in Elena's direction. Nathaniel watched the exchange with quiet interest. She fears you, he observed once Margaret had moved out of earshot. She fears losing control, Elena corrected softly. There is a difference. Perhaps, he said, though I suspect, in your stepmother's mind, they may be the same thing entirely. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and cautious conversation. Nathaniel remained near Elena for much of the night, and though he was called away occasionally to greet other guests, he returned each time, his attention clearly drawn to her in a way that did not go unnoticed by the watching crowd. As the night wore on, whispers began to spread through the ballroom, curious speculation about the quiet young woman who had captured the Duke's attention so completely. Elena felt the weight of those whispers, some curious, some unkind, but for the first time in years, she found she did not care as much as she once might have. When the carriage finally arrived to take her home, long after Margaret and her daughters had departed in stony silence, Nathaniel walked her to the entrance himself. Thank you, Elena said quietly, for tonight. There is no need for thanks, he replied. You owe me nothing. He paused, studying her face in the soft lantern light. I would like to see you again, Elena, if you are willing. Elena's heart quickened, hope and caution warring within her once more. My circumstances are complicated, Your Grace. Most worthwhile things are, he said simply. I am not easily discouraged. As the carriage pulled away into the night, Elena watched Ashworth Hall fade slowly into the darkness behind her, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. Nora was waiting at the servants' entrance when Elena finally arrived home, a single candle burning in her hand, worry etched across her face. The moment she saw Elena's expression, relief flooded her features. You are smiling, Nora said, almost disbelieving. I have not seen you smile like that in years. Margaret tried to humiliate me in front of everyone, Elena admitted, stepping inside and allowing Nora to help her out of the borrowed gown with careful hands. She nearly succeeded. But she did not, Nora said, watching Elena's face carefully. No, Elena said softly, still hardly believing it herself. She did not. The Duke stepped in before she could finish. Nora's eyebrows lifted in surprise. The Duke himself? Elena nodded, recounting the evening in halting, disbelieving fragments. The confrontation, the dance, the quiet conversation that had followed. Nora listened without interrupting, though her expression grew thoughtful, almost cautious, as the story unfolded. Be careful, my dear, she said finally, folding the gown gently over her arm. Kindness from a man of his standing can be a genuine gift, but it can also draw dangerous attention, especially from those who feel threatened by it. You mean Margaret. I mean Margaret, Nora confirmed. She will not forgive this easily. A public humiliation, in front of the entire county, with the Duke himself choosing you over her own daughters. She will look for a way to strike back. Elena's brief happiness dimmed slightly at the warning, though she knew Nora spoke the truth. Margaret had built her entire position in the house, and in society, on control. Tonight, for the first time, that control had slipped, publicly and completely, and Margaret was not a woman who accepted such losses quietly. Let her try, Elena said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. I am tired of being afraid of her, Nora. I have spent 3 years shrinking myself smaller and smaller, hoping she would eventually stop resenting me for simply existing. It has never worked. Perhaps it is time I stopped trying. Nora studied her for a long moment, something like pride flickering behind her tired eyes. Your father would be proud to hear you speak this way. The mention of her father brought a familiar ache to Elena's chest, though it was softened, tonight, by something warmer underneath. Do you think he would approve? Of the Duke, I mean. I think, Nora said carefully, that your father always wanted you to be seen for who you truly are, not for what others decided you should become. If the Duke sees that in you, truly sees it, then perhaps this is exactly the sort of thing your father hoped for. Elena climbed the narrow staircase to her small room later that night, her mind still turning over every moment of the evening. She lay awake long after the candle had burned low, replaying the sound of Nathaniel's voice, the steadiness of his hand guiding her through the dance, the quiet intensity in his eyes when he had promised to see her again. She did not know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that in a grand study across the county, Margaret sat awake as well, her fury simmering into something colder and far more calculated. Margaret had lost a battle tonight, humiliated in front of the very society she had spent years courting. But she had not lost the war, not yet, and she was already beginning to plan exactly how she intended to reclaim what she believed rightfully belonged to her daughters, whatever the cost to Elena might be. As the carriage of Elena's memory faded into the quiet dark, and Ashworth Hall grew distant behind her, one truth remained certain. For the first time since her father's passing, someone had truly seen her, and had chosen to stand beside her rather than let her disappear. Word of the previous night's events had already begun spreading through the county by the time the sun rose the following morning. Servants carried gossip between households faster than any letter could travel, and by midday, it seemed every family within riding distance had heard some version of the story, each one more exaggerated than the last. Margaret sat in her study, a cup of tea growing cold beside her, listening as her lady's maid recounted the latest rumors circulating through town. According to one version, the Duke had declared his intentions toward Elena openly, in front of the entire ballroom. According to another, Margaret herself had been publicly reprimanded by Nathaniel for her cruelty. Neither version was entirely accurate, but both were doing considerable damage to the reputation Margaret had spent years carefully constructing. This cannot continue, Margaret said sharply, dismissing the maid with a wave of her hand. Once alone, she allowed her composed mask to slip entirely, her expression twisting into something bitter and calculating. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much dignity, currying favor with the right families, positioning Clara and Violet for exactly this kind of opportunity, only to watch it slip away in a single evening because of Elena. Quiet, forgettable Elena, who was supposed to remain hidden away, grateful simply to have a roof over her head. Margaret rose from her chair and moved to the window, staring out at the gardens where Elena had once played as a child, long before Margaret had entered this household. There had always been something about the girl that unsettled her, a quiet strength beneath the surface that no amount of cruelty seemed able to fully extinguish. Margaret had assumed, wrongly it now seemed, that enough humiliation would eventually break that strength entirely. She would need a new approach. Across the county, at Ashworth Hall, Nathaniel sat in his own study, though his thoughts were far less focused on strategy, and far more consumed by the memory of a pale blue gown and steady brown eyes that had refused to look away, even when the entire room turned against her. His secretary, a quiet and efficient man named Edmund, entered with the morning correspondence, pausing when he noticed the Duke's distracted expression. "Your Grace, is something troubling you?" Nathaniel glanced up, considering how much to share. "Do you recall the Whitmore family, Edmund? Elena Whitmore's father, specifically." Edmund's brow furrowed in thought. "Vaguely, Your Grace, a respected family, though I understand there were difficulties following the father's passing. Some confusion regarding the estate, if memory serves." Confusion, Nathaniel repeated slowly. "Tell me what you know." Edmund hesitated, clearly searching his memory for details long buried beneath years of other business. As I recall, there were rumors at the time, nothing substantiated, suggesting the estate's debts were larger than expected, requiring the stepmother, Margaret, to assume control of the finances rather quickly after his death. I do not believe the matter was ever formally investigated. Investigate it now, Nathaniel said, his voice carrying quiet authority. Quietly, I want to understand exactly what happened to that family's fortune, and how quickly it happened. May I ask why, Your Grace? Nathaniel considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. Because something about last night troubled me deeply, Edmund. A young woman who should have been welcomed with warmth in her own family was instead treated as an intruder, humiliated in front of half the county by the very woman entrusted with her care. I intend to understand why. Edmund nodded and departed to begin his inquiries, leaving Nathaniel alone once more with his thoughts. He found himself replaying the conversation from the previous evening, the careful way Elena had spoken of her stepmother, guarded but honest, without the bitterness one might expect from someone treated so unfairly. There had been dignity in the way she carried herself, even in humiliation, a quiet resilience that Nathaniel found he could not easily forget. He had met countless young women throughout the seasons, most of them polished and eager to impress, reciting rehearsed compliments and practiced laughter designed to catch his attention. Elena had done none of that. She had simply been herself, honest and unguarded, even when the entire room had turned against her. It was, he realized, precisely why he could not stop thinking of her. 3 days passed before Nathaniel found a reasonable excuse to call upon the Whitmore estate. He arranged for correspondence to be sent ahead, framing his visit as a matter of neighborly business regarding shared boundary lands between their properties, a pretense Edmund had helped construct carefully enough to withstand Margaret's scrutiny. When his carriage arrived at the estate, Margaret herself greeted him at the entrance, her composure fully restored, her smile polished and welcoming, despite the tension Nathaniel could sense simmering just beneath the surface. Your Grace, what an unexpected honor, she said, curtsying gracefully. Please come in. I would be delighted to discuss whatever matters bring you to our home. Nathaniel accepted her invitation with practiced politeness, though his eyes moved briefly across the entrance hall, searching for any sign of Elena among the quiet corridors. He found none. Margaret led him into a formal sitting room, calling for tea to be brought, and began discussing the fictional boundary matter with practiced ease, clearly relieved that his visit appeared to have nothing to do with the events of the ball. Nathaniel listened politely, offering measured responses, though his attention remained divided, listening for any sound of movement elsewhere in the house. It was nearly half an hour before Elena appeared, drawn by the sound of an unfamiliar carriage arriving, still dressed in the simple worn clothing she wore for her daily household duties. She froze in the doorway of the sitting room, clearly startled to find the Duke seated across from her stepmother. Elena, Margaret said sharply, her tone carrying a clear warning beneath its polite surface. We have a guest. Perhaps you should return to your duties. But Nathaniel had already risen from his seat, his expression brightening in a way he did not bother to hide. Miss Whitmore, I am pleased to see you again. Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though she said nothing further, clearly unwilling to create another scene in front of the Duke so soon after the disaster of the ball. Your Grace, Elena said carefully, offering a small curtsy, her cheeks flushing slightly at being caught in her plain household clothing. I did not realize we were expecting visitors. The visit was arranged rather suddenly, Nathaniel admitted, glancing briefly at Margaret before returning his attention to Elena. I confess the boundary matter was somewhat exaggerated on my part. I had hoped for an opportunity to see you again, if you were willing. Margaret's composure cracked slightly at the blunt admission, though she quickly masked her irritation behind a tight smile. How thoughtful, Your Grace, though I am certain Elena has considerable duties requiring her attention this afternoon. I am certain those duties can wait, Nathaniel said smoothly, his tone polite but unmistakably firm. If Miss Whitmore is willing, I would enjoy a short walk through the gardens, purely to discuss estate matters further, of course. Elena glanced hesitantly toward Margaret, uncertain whether accepting would create further difficulty once the Duke departed. But something in Nathaniel's steady gaze gave her courage, and she found herself nodding before caution could overrule her. I would be glad to, Your Grace. Margaret's smile remained fixed in place, though her eyes had grown considerably colder. Of course. Please, enjoy the gardens. As they stepped outside into the mild afternoon air, away from Margaret's watchful presence, Elena allowed herself to relax slightly, though her nerves remained tightly wound. You did not need to fabricate an excuse to visit, she said quietly, once they had walked far enough to avoid being overheard from the house. Perhaps not, Nathaniel admitted, though I suspected your stepmother would be considerably less welcoming if I arrived simply to see you directly. You suspected correctly, Elena said, a faint smile touching her lips despite herself. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, moving along the familiar garden paths Elena had wandered since childhood, though they felt different somehow, walking beside someone who genuinely seemed interested in her thoughts rather than dismissive of them. May I ask you something honestly? Nathaniel said eventually, his tone careful, as though weighing how much to press. You may ask, Elena said, though caution crept back into her voice. Your father's estate. I understand there were difficulties following his passing, debts that required your stepmother to assume control rather quickly. Do you know the details of what happened? Elena's expression shifted, surprise and wariness mixing together. Why do you ask, Your Grace? Because something about it troubles me, Nathaniel admitted honestly. Your father was, by all accounts, a respected and prudent man. It seems unusual for such significant debts to appear so suddenly and be resolved so quickly, entirely under your stepmother's management. Elena hesitated, memories of the confusing weeks following her father's death rising unwillingly to the surface. I was young when it happened, Your Grace. Margaret handled all matters concerning the estate. I was told there were debts my father had kept hidden, mismanagement that required immediate correction. I had no reason to question it at the time. I was too consumed with grief to think clearly about anything else. And now? Nathaniel asked gently, looking back with clearer eyes. Elena considered the question seriously, memories shifting into new, uncomfortable focus. Her father had always been meticulous with the estate's finances, proud of the stability he had built for her future. The sudden appearance of crushing debts, discovered only after his death, had never entirely made sense, though she had been too young and too grief-stricken to question it at the time. I do not know, she admitted slowly. I suppose I never allowed myself to question it too closely. It felt easier somehow to simply accept what I was told. Would you be willing to question it now? Nathaniel asked. I have already begun a quiet inquiry into the matter. I do not wish to raise false hope, but if something improper occurred, I intend to uncover the truth. Elena stopped walking, turning to face him fully, uncertainty and fragile hope warring across her features. Why would you involve yourself in something so far removed from your own concerns, Your Grace? Nathaniel considered his answer carefully before speaking. Because I watched a woman humiliate you in front of the entire county, without a single flicker of guilt or hesitation. That kind of cruelty rarely exists in isolation, Elena. If she was capable of that, publicly, without shame, I find myself wondering what she has been capable of privately, for years, when no one was watching at all. Elena felt tears sting unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to appear fragile in front of him. Thank you, she whispered, for caring enough to ask the question at all. You deserve far more than questions, Nathaniel said quietly. You deserve answers. They continued their walk through the gardens as the afternoon light began to soften into evening gold, their conversation gradually shifting toward lighter topics, though the weight of what had been discussed lingered quietly between them. By the time Nathaniel finally departed, promising to return once his inquiries yielded further information, Elena found herself standing at the entrance of the house, watching his carriage disappear down the long drive, her heart caught somewhere between fear and fragile, dangerous hope. She did not yet know how deep the truth would run, nor how much it would eventually cost Margaret to keep it buried, but for the first time in 3 long years, Elena allowed herself to believe that the answers she had never dared to seek might finally be within reach. Inside the house, Margaret had watched the entire exchange from an upstairs window, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the curtain. She could not hear their words, but she did not need to. The easy way Nathaniel leaned toward Elena, the careful attention in his posture, told her everything she needed to know. Whatever fragile hope she had clung to that the Duke's interest was merely a passing gesture of chivalry had now fully collapsed. She turned from the window and summoned Clara to her private chambers, her mind already racing through possibilities. He is asking questions, Margaret said quietly, once the door had closed behind her daughter. About the estate. About your father's debts. Clara's face paled slightly. Do you think he suspects something? I think, Margaret said carefully, that we must be very careful from this point forward. The documents are secure, buried among years of other records. No one has reason to look closely enough to find them, provided nothing draws undue attention. She paused, her eyes narrowing with calculation. Elena must be discouraged from encouraging his visits further. If she disappears from his interest entirely, his curiosity will fade naturally, as these things often do. And if it does not? Clara asked quietly. Margaret did not answer immediately, her expression hardening into something colder and more determined. Then we will need a different solution. Meanwhile, at Ashworth Hall, Edmund worked late into the evening, poring over correspondence and old records he had managed to gather through careful, discreet inquiries among former associates of Elena's father. What he found, though incomplete, was troubling enough to warrant further investigation. Several merchants who had once done regular business with Elena's father reported no knowledge of any significant debts at the time of his death. In fact, multiple accounts suggested the estate had been entirely solvent, its finances carefully managed and free of the crushing burden Margaret had later claimed. The debts, it seemed, had appeared only after Margaret assumed control, documented through a single solicitor whose practice had since closed, its records conveniently unavailable for review. Edmund brought his findings to Nathaniel the following morning, watching the Duke's expression darken as he read through the gathered notes. "This solicitor," Nathaniel said slowly, tapping the paper before him. "Do we know his current whereabouts?" "Not yet, Your Grace. His practice closed rather abruptly, a little over 2 years ago. I have inquiries underway, but progress has been slow." "Continue the inquiries," Nathaniel said, quietly but thoroughly. "If Margaret fabricated these debts to seize control of the estate, I intend to have proof substantial enough to withstand any challenge she might raise." "And Miss Whitmore?" Edmund asked carefully. "Will you inform her of what we have found so far?" Nathaniel considered the question, weighing caution against honesty. "Not yet. The evidence remains incomplete, and I have no wish to raise false hope, nor to place her in further danger should Margaret suspect what we are uncovering. For now, we proceed carefully and quietly until the truth is beyond dispute." As the sun set fully over the county that evening, 2 households moved forward, along collision courses neither fully understood yet. In one, a mother prepared to defend a fortune built on deception, however far she might need to go to protect it. In the other, a duke and his quiet, determined secretary worked steadily to uncover a truth that had remained buried for years, unaware of just how far Margaret was willing to go to keep it hidden. And in her small room near the kitchens, Elena lay awake once more, thinking of steady gray eyes and gentle questions that had, for the first time, given voice to doubts she had never quite allowed herself to fully examine. Somewhere beneath the grief and the years of quiet obedience, a small flame of suspicion had finally been lit, and Elena found she could not extinguish it, even if she had wanted to. 2 weeks passed, and Nathaniel's visits to the Whitmore estate became a quiet, careful ritual, each one framed under some new pretense that allowed him a legitimate reason to call. Margaret grew increasingly tense with each visit, though she maintained her polished composure in front of him, unwilling to risk further damage to her reputation after the disaster of the ball. Elena found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. Small stolen hours spent walking the gardens or sitting in the sitting room under Margaret's watchful, resentful gaze. Nathaniel never pressed her further about the estate's finances during these visits, sensing perhaps that trust needed to be built slowly, carefully, before such heavy matters could be safely discussed again. Instead, they spoke of simpler things. Elena learned that Nathaniel had lost his own father young as well, thrust into responsibilities he had never fully prepared for, learning to navigate a world of politics and expectation largely alone. There was an understanding between them, unspoken but deeply felt, born from shared grief and the particular loneliness of losing a parent before truly being ready to stand without them. "You rarely speak of your mother," Nathaniel observed one afternoon, as they walked along the edge of a small pond near the eastern boundary of the estate. "She died when I was very young," Elena said softly. "I remember very little of her directly. Mostly feelings, warmth, the sound of her voice singing softly before I fell asleep. My father kept her memory alive for me, in small ways. Her favorite flowers planted along this very path, her gown, the one I wore to the ball." Nathaniel's expression softened. "It suited you beautifully." "Nora told me the same thing," Elena said, a faint smile touching her lips. "She said I looked just like her." "I believe it," Nathaniel said quietly, something warm and sincere in his tone that made Elena's cheeks flush slightly. Their conversations, quiet and unhurried, deepened steadily over those weeks, each visit peeling back another careful layer of the walls Elena had built around herself after years of neglect and cruelty. She found herself, cautiously and almost against her own will, beginning to trust him, to believe that perhaps not every person of standing viewed her as invisible or unworthy. But Margaret watched these growing visits with mounting alarm, and eventually decided that quiet observation was no longer sufficient. Action was required. She began by shifting her focus entirely toward Clara, arranging for her eldest daughter to be present during as many of the Duke's visits as possible, positioning her carefully in conversation, ensuring she was dressed in the finest gowns the household could still afford. Clara, eager to please her mother and genuinely hopeful of catching the Duke's attention herself, threw herself into the effort with enthusiasm, though Nathaniel's polite attention toward her remained exactly that, polite, nothing more. When subtle positioning failed to produce results, Margaret grew bolder. She began quietly circulating rumors of her own among the surrounding families, careful whispers suggesting that Elena's grief following her father's death had never fully resolved, that she suffered from strange moods and unstable behavior that made her an unsuitable match for any respectable gentleman, let alone a duke. The rumors spread slowly at first, then gained momentum, as such things often did among idle society eager for fresh gossip. Nathaniel's own household began to hear whispers of these claims, and Edmund, ever cautious, felt obligated to raise the matter directly with his employer. "Your Grace, I feel it necessary to inform you of certain rumors circulating regarding Miss Whitmore's character," Edmund said carefully one morning, clearly uncomfortable with the subject. "I do not believe them credible, given what we have already uncovered regarding her stepmother's history of deception. But I felt you should be aware." Nathaniel's jaw tightened as Edmund relayed the substance of the rumors, anger flickering briefly behind his composed expression. "Let me guess the source of these particular whispers. I suspect strongly, Your Grace, though I have no direct proof." "Of course not," Nathaniel said grimly. "Margaret is far too careful for that." He rose from his desk, pacing slowly across the study, his mind working through the implications. "This confirms what we already suspected. She is threatened, and she is growing desperate." "Desperate people make mistakes, Edmund. We simply need to remain patient enough to catch her when she does. And in the meantime, Your Grace, these rumors, left unaddressed, could cause genuine damage to Miss Whitmore's reputation." Nathaniel considered this carefully. "Then I will address them directly, publicly if necessary. I have no intention of allowing Margaret's lies to define how society perceives Elena." That evening, Nathaniel called upon the Whitmore estate once more, though this visit carried a different weight than those before it. He requested a private audience with Elena, and though Margaret attempted to insist upon a chaperone, Nathaniel's calm but immovable insistence eventually won out, leaving Elena and Nathaniel alone together in the small garden behind the house. "I have heard troubling rumors," Nathaniel said carefully, once they were settled beneath the shade of an old oak tree, "regarding your character, your state of mind following your father's passing." Elena's face paled slightly, humiliation and exhaustion mixing together as she realized the extent of Margaret's latest campaign against her. "I suppose I should not be surprised." "I do not believe them," Nathaniel said firmly. "Not for a moment, but I wished for you to hear that directly from me, rather than through whispers and speculation." "Thank you," Elena said quietly, though weariness colored her voice. "It seems Margaret has decided quiet observation is no longer enough." "She is frightened," Nathaniel said, "frightened of what continues to grow between us, and frightened, I suspect, of what further inquiry into your father's estate might eventually reveal." Elena looked up at him sharply. "Have you learned something more?" Nathaniel hesitated, weighing his earlier decision to proceed carefully against the growing urgency of the situation. "Edmund has uncovered troubling inconsistencies regarding the debts your stepmother claimed following your father's death. Several merchants who once did regular business with him report no knowledge of any significant financial trouble at the time. The solicitor who documented the debts has since disappeared entirely, his practice closed, his records unavailable." Elena sat in stunned silence for a long moment, memories and suspicions long buried beginning to surface all at once. "You believe she fabricated the debts, that she took control of my father's estate through deception?" "I believe it is a strong possibility," Nathaniel said carefully. "Though I do not yet have proof substantial enough to challenge her claim formally. I need more time, Elena, and I need you to trust me, even as Margaret grows increasingly desperate to discourage that trust." Elena felt tears sting unexpectedly at her eyes, grief and anger and fragile hope tangling together inside her chest. "All these years," she whispered, "I told myself grief had simply made me foolish, that I had misunderstood the situation somehow. I never allowed myself to fully believe she could have done something so deliberately cruel." "You were a grieving child," Nathaniel said gently. "There is no shame in trusting the adults meant to protect you, even when they betray that trust so completely." They sat together in silence for a while, the weight of the revelation settling slowly between them. Eventually, Elena spoke again, her voice steadier than before. "What do we do now?" We continue searching for proof, Nathaniel said. And in the meantime, I intend to make my intentions toward you known publicly, clearly enough that Margaret's rumors lose whatever power they currently hold. Elena's breath caught slightly at the implication behind his words. Your Grace, that could bring considerable difficulty upon you as well, associating yourself so openly with a family under such suspicion. I am not concerned with difficulty, Nathaniel said simply. I am concerned with what is right. He reached out, taking her hand gently in his own. I have not felt this certain about anything in a very long time, Elena. I do not intend to let Margaret's schemes discourage me now. Elena looked down at their joined hands, warmth spreading through her chest, despite the uncertainty of everything else swirling around them. Neither do I, she said quietly, finding unexpected strength in the simple admission. As Nathaniel's carriage departed later that evening, Margaret watched from an upstairs window once more, her expression carved from pure, cold fury. She had underestimated the Duke's determination, and worse, she had underestimated exactly how far he was already willing to dig into matters she had believed safely buried years ago. She would need to act quickly now, before his careful investigation uncovered proof substantial enough to destroy everything she had built. Whatever it cost, whatever drastic measure it required, Margaret was determined not to lose everything to a stepdaughter she had spent years trying to erase entirely. That same night, long after the household had gone quiet, Margaret sat alone in her study with a single letter spread across her desk, its wax seal already broken. It was addressed to a man named Harold Pierce, the very solicitor who had once documented the fabricated debts against her late husband's estate, now living quietly under a different name in a distant town, well away from prying eyes. She had kept the arrangement secret for years, paying Pierce a modest yet steady sum to remain silent and unreachable, ensuring no one could ever trace the false documents back to their true origin. Now, with Nathaniel's secretary clearly searching for exactly that connection, Margaret understood the arrangement needed to change. She began writing quickly, her handwriting sharp and hurried across the page, instructing Pierce to destroy any remaining copies of the original correspondence between them, and to prepare, if necessary, to relocate somewhere even further from reach, should questions ever arrive at his door directly. She sealed the letter and called for a trusted servant to deliver it discreetly before dawn. With that immediate danger addressed, Margaret turned her attention toward Clara, summoning her daughter once more to the study despite the late hour. I need you to understand something, Margaret said, once Clara had settled nervously into the chair across from her. Everything I have built, everything I have secured for this family, depends entirely on maintaining our position. If the Duke's suspicions are allowed to grow further, if he uncovers proof of what happened after your father's passing, we lose everything, not simply the estate, our standing in society, our futures entirely. What would you have me do? Clara asked quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. You will continue positioning yourself favorably with the Duke, Margaret said firmly. But more than that, I need you to watch Elena closely. Any correspondence she receives, any visits she makes beyond the estate, any conversation she has with servants who might carry information to Ashworth Hall, I need to know everything. Clara hesitated, guilt flickering briefly across her features. Mother, do you truly believe it wise to continue this way? If the Duke discovers the truth regardless of what we do, he will not discover the truth, Margaret snapped, her composure cracking briefly under the weight of her own mounting desperation. Not if we are careful. Not if you help me, Clara. This family's future depends on it. Clara nodded reluctantly, though doubt lingered clearly in her expression as she departed the study, leaving Margaret alone once more with her racing thoughts and the quiet, gnawing fear that despite every precaution, the careful lies she had constructed years ago were finally beginning to crumble beyond her control. Elsewhere in the house, unaware of the conversation unfolding just rooms away, Nora moved quietly through the darkened corridors, unable to sleep despite the late hour. She had overheard fragments of Margaret's hushed conversation through a partially open door, enough to understand that something significant was unfolding, though not enough to grasp the full picture. She made her way to Elena's small room near the kitchens, finding the young woman still awake, staring thoughtfully at the ceiling above her narrow bed. You should be sleeping, Nora said softly, settling onto the edge of the bed beside her. I cannot, Elena admitted. Too much has happened tonight to allow my mind any rest. Nora hesitated, weighing how much to share about what she had overheard. I believe your stepmother is frightened, Elena. Truly frightened, in a way I have not seen from her before. Whatever the Duke and his secretary are uncovering, it seems to be working. Elena sat up slowly, hope and apprehension mixing together in her chest. Do you think we are close to the truth, Nora? to finally understanding what truly happened to my father's estate? I believe, Nora said carefully, that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how carefully it has been buried. Your stepmother knows this as well as anyone. It is precisely why she grows more desperate with each passing day. The two women sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of uncertain hope settling gently between them. Outside, the night stretched on quietly over the county, unaware of the storm steadily building beneath its calm surface. A storm that would soon bring years of carefully hidden deception crashing down upon the household that had tried so hard to keep it buried. The battle between them, quiet and simmering for weeks, was about to become considerably more dangerous for everyone involved. The invitation arrived a week later, addressed formally to the entire Whitmore household, requesting their presence at a gathering hosted by Nathaniel's own family at Ashworth Hall, a smaller affair than the grand ball, though still significant enough that refusing would raise unwanted questions among the surrounding families. Margaret accepted the invitation with outward grace, though inwardly her nerves had grown increasingly frayed over the preceding days. Pierce had confirmed, through a hastily written response, that he had destroyed the remaining documents as instructed, but his letter carried an unmistakable note of anxiety, warning Margaret that he intended to disappear entirely once the matter was fully resolved, unwilling to risk further exposure for the modest sum she continued to provide him. Elena, for her part, approached the gathering with cautious optimism, though the memory of the previous ball's humiliation lingered uncomfortably in her thoughts. Nathaniel had sent word ahead, through careful and discreet correspondence, promising that Edmund's investigation had finally uncovered something substantial, something he intended to address directly during the gathering itself. The evening began quietly enough, guests mingling comfortably beneath the soft glow of candlelight, conversation flowing easily across the elegant reception hall. Elena remained close to Nora, who had been permitted to attend as her personal companion for the evening, both women watching carefully for any sign of the confrontation Nathaniel had hinted might unfold. Margaret circulated confidently among the other guests, her composure fully restored despite the anxiety simmering beneath the surface. Clara and Violet remained close beside her, both dressed elegantly, both still hopeful, despite everything, that the evening might yet turn favorably in their direction. It was nearly an hour into the gathering when Nathaniel finally approached the small cluster of guests where Margaret stood in comfortable conversation, Edmund following a step behind him, a leather folder held carefully beneath one arm. "Lady Whitmore," Nathaniel said, his tone polite but carrying an unmistakable edge of formality that immediately drew the attention of everyone nearby. "I wonder if I might have a word, regarding a matter of some importance." Margaret's smile remained fixed, though her eyes flickered briefly with wary calculation. "Of course, Your Grace, though perhaps somewhere more private might be appropriate?" "I think not," Nathaniel said calmly, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests, several of whom had already begun to quiet their own conversations, sensing the tension building in the air. "I believe this matter concerns enough people present tonight that it deserves to be addressed openly." Margaret's composure faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly, lifting her chin with practiced defiance. "I am not certain I understand your meaning, Your Grace." "Allow me to clarify," Nathaniel said, nodding toward Edmund, who stepped forward and opened the leather folder carefully, revealing a collection of carefully organized documents. "My secretary has spent the past several weeks investigating the circumstances surrounding the death of Elena's father, and the subsequent debts that led to your assumption of control over his estate." A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the nearby guests, drawn increasingly toward the unfolding confrontation. Margaret's face paled visibly, though she attempted to maintain her composure. "This is hardly the appropriate setting for private financial matters, Your Grace." "I disagree," Nathaniel said firmly, "particularly given that our investigation has uncovered no evidence whatsoever of any significant debts existing at the time of Elena's father's death. Quite the opposite, in fact. Multiple merchants who conducted regular business with him confirmed the estate was entirely solvent, its finances carefully managed, and free of any burden." "That is absurd," Margaret said sharply, though a slight tremor had entered her voice. "The debts were thoroughly documented, verified by a licensed solicitor at the time." "Ah yes," Nathaniel said, his tone carrying a dangerous calm. "The solicitor, a man named Harold Pierce, whose practice closed rather abruptly 2 years ago, and who has since relocated under considerable secrecy, receiving what appears to be regular payments from your own household accounts." Gasps rippled audibly through the gathering crowd now, guests turning toward one another in shocked whispers as the implications became increasingly clear. Margaret's face had gone entirely white, her earlier composure completely abandoned. "You have no proof of any such arrangement," she said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. It was at this moment that Nora stepped forward from beside Elena, her expression steady, despite the weight of every eye now turning toward her. "I have proof, Your Grace," she said clearly, drawing a small bundle of aged letters from beneath her shawl. "I have served this household since before Elena was born. 3 years ago, shortly after her father's passing, I discovered these letters hidden among Lady Margaret's private correspondence while attending to her rooms. I did not fully understand their significance at the time, but I kept them regardless, sensing they might one day matter." She handed the letters carefully to Edmund, who reviewed them briefly before passing them to Nathaniel. The documents, written in Pierce's own hand, detailed clearly the fabrication of debts against the Whitmore estate, along with explicit instructions from Margaret regarding the falsified documentation required to justify her assumption of financial control. The gathering had fallen into stunned, heavy silence now, dozens of guests watching as Nathaniel reviewed the damning evidence, his expression hardening with quiet fury. "These letters," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "confirm precisely what my investigation has already suggested. That Margaret Whitmore deliberately fabricated debts against her late husband's estate, in collusion with a corrupt solicitor, in order to seize control of finances and property rightfully belonging to Elena." Margaret's mouth opened, though no words emerged immediately, her carefully constructed world collapsing entirely in front of the very society she had spent years courting so carefully. "This is a mistake," she finally managed, her voice thin and desperate. "A misunderstanding. Nora has always resented my presence in this household, ever since I married Elena's father. These letters could easily be fabricated, an act of spite from a bitter old servant." "I do not believe that is the case," Nathaniel said coldly, "particularly given that Pierce's own bank records, which my secretary has also obtained through careful inquiry, confirm regular payments from your household accounts continuing to this very day. Payments that align precisely with the dates referenced in these letters." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Margaret's ragged breathing as the full weight of her exposure settled over the gathering. Clara stood frozen beside her mother, humiliation and dawning understanding mixing across her features, while Violet had already begun to quietly weep, overwhelmed by the sudden collapse of everything she had believed about her family's position. Elena stepped forward slowly, her own heart pounding, though a strange calm had settled over her despite the chaos unfolding around them. "Why?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "I trusted you. I tried, for years, to love you as a mother, despite everything. Why would you do this?" Margaret turned toward her stepdaughter, something raw and broken flickering briefly behind her earlier composure. "Because your father left you everything," she said finally, her voice cracking. "Everything, Elena, while my own daughters were left with nothing beyond what generosity your father chose to extend. I could not accept watching you inherit a fortune while Clara and Violet were left dependent on whatever charity you decided to offer them. So you stole it instead," Elena said, grief and quiet anger mixing together in her voice. "You destroyed my trust, humiliated me for years, all to secure something that was never rightfully yours to take." Margaret had no response, her earlier defiance finally crumbling entirely under the weight of public exposure and her stepdaughter's quiet, devastating honesty. Nathaniel stepped forward then, addressing the gathered crowd with clear authority. "Given the evidence presented tonight, I intend to ensure this matter receives full legal review. Elena Whitmore's inheritance, fraudulently seized through deception and forgery, will be restored to her entirely, along with whatever additional compensation the courts deem appropriate given the circumstances." Margaret sank slowly into a nearby chair, her face buried in her hands, the full reality of her exposure and impending ruin finally settling over her completely. Clara moved hesitantly to her mother's side, though her own expression remained conflicted, caught between years of loyalty and the dawning realization of exactly how deep her mother's deception had run. Elena watched the scene unfold with a complicated tangle of emotions, grief for the family she had once hoped to build with Margaret, relief at finally understanding the truth, and a quiet, steady anger that had been building silently for 3 long years, finally given voice. Nora moved to stand beside her, placing a gentle, steadying hand on her shoulder. "It is done," she said softly. "The truth is finally free, Elena. Whatever happens next, you no longer need to carry the weight of doubt and confusion any longer." Elena nodded slowly, tears finally slipping free as the weight of years of suppressed grief and suspicion began, at last, to release its hold on her. Nathaniel approached quietly, offering no words at first, simply standing steady beside her as the gathered crowd began to disperse into hushed, urgent conversation. the scandal already destined to spread through the county by morning. "Thank you," Elena whispered eventually, looking up at him through tear-filled eyes. "For believing me, for not giving up until the truth was finally uncovered. You never needed convincing from me," Nathaniel said gently. "You always knew, somewhere beneath the doubt Margaret worked so hard to instill. I simply helped bring that truth into the light." As the gathering slowly dispersed around them, Margaret remaining seated in stunned, broken silence, Elena felt something shift deeply within her, a weight lifting that she had carried for so long she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Later, once most of the guests had departed and only a small handful of household members remained in the quiet aftermath of the evening, Clara approached Elena hesitantly, her eyes still red from crying, her earlier resentment replaced entirely by something closer to shame. "I did not know," Clara said quietly, standing awkwardly a few feet away. "About the letters, about Pierce, any of it. I knew Mother resented how Father's will was written, but I never imagined she would go so far." Elena studied her stepsister carefully, uncertain how much of the apology to trust after years of quiet participation in Margaret's cruelty. "You benefited from what she did, Clara. Every gown, every advantage came at my expense, whether you fully understood the reason or not." Clara flinched, though she did not argue the point. "You are right. I cannot ask you to forgive that easily, nor do I expect you to. I only wanted you to know that I did not knowingly help her steal from you, whatever else I am guilty of." Violet stood a short distance away, still visibly shaken, watching the exchange with quiet uncertainty. Unlike Clara, she had always been the gentler of the two sisters, less invested in Margaret's schemes, more often a quiet bystander than an active participant in the years of small cruelties Elena had endured. "I am sorry," Violet said softly, stepping forward hesitantly. "I should have said something, years ago, when I noticed how differently you were treated. I was afraid of Mother's anger. That is no excuse, but it is the truth." Elena felt the sharp edges of her anger soften slightly at the genuine remorse in both their voices, though the wound of so many years could not be healed in a single evening. "I appreciate you saying that," she said carefully. "I do not know yet what our relationship will become, moving forward, but I do not wish to carry this anger toward either of you indefinitely, provided you are truly willing to build something more honest between us." Clara nodded, relief and lingering grief mixing across her features, while Violet reached out tentatively, offering a brief, uncertain embrace that Elena found herself accepting, if only partially, a small step toward whatever fractured peace might eventually be possible between them. Margaret remained seated apart from the exchange, watching her daughters reconcile, however cautiously, with the stepdaughter she had spent years trying to diminish. The isolation on her face was unmistakable, the full weight of her actions finally settling over her, now that her careful web of deception had collapsed entirely in front of the very society whose approval she had chased so desperately. Nathaniel approached Elena once the sisters had stepped away, his expression gentler now than the cold authority he had carried during the confrontation itself. "Are you well?" he asked quietly. "I do not entirely know," Elena admitted honestly. "Relieved, certainly, vindicated in a way I did not expect to feel so completely, but also exhausted, and strangely sad, despite everything Margaret has done." "That sadness makes sense," Nathaniel said gently. "You lost more than an inheritance 3 years ago. You lost the family you hoped to build, however imperfectly, after your father's death. Discovering the depth of that betrayal does not erase the grief of what you had hoped for instead." Elena looked up at him, grateful for the understanding in his voice. "How did you become so perceptive about grief, Your Grace?" "I have carried my own share of it," he said simply. "It teaches a person to recognize it more easily in others." They stood together quietly for a moment, the chaos of the evening finally beginning to settle into something calmer, more manageable. Edmund approached briefly to inform Nathaniel that arrangements were already underway to formally notify the appropriate legal authorities, ensuring the fraudulent transfer of Elena's inheritance would be properly investigated and corrected through official channels in the coming weeks. "This will take time," Nathaniel said, once Edmund had departed to continue his work. "Legal proceedings of this nature rarely move quickly, particularly given Margaret's social connections, but the evidence is substantial, and I do not believe she will find many allies willing to defend her once the full details become known." "And in the meantime?" Elena asked. "Where do I stand exactly?" "In the meantime," Nathaniel said carefully, "I would like to offer you a place at Ashworth Hall, under the care and chaperonage of my own aunt, until matters are fully resolved. It would remove you from any further difficulty at the Whitmore estate, and allow the proceedings to continue without further interference from Margaret." Elena considered the offer carefully, weighing the relief of escaping Margaret's household against the uncertainty of such a significant change. "I would need to bring Nora with me," she said finally. "She has been the only true kindness I have known these past 3 years. I will not leave her behind." "Of course," Nathaniel said, a faint smile touching his lips. "I would expect nothing less." As the last of the evening's guests finally departed, and Margaret sat alone in the emptying hall, the full magnitude of her collapse settling over her in heavy, suffocating silence, Elena allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to imagine a future built on truth rather than survival. Whatever difficulties remained ahead, whatever legal proceedings and social consequences would follow in the coming weeks, she understood clearly, for the first time in years, that she was finally free. The weeks that followed brought a whirlwind of change unlike anything Elena had experienced since her father's death. She moved into Ashworth Hall alongside Nora, welcomed warmly by Nathaniel's aunt, a sharp-witted widow named Constance who took an immediate liking to Elena's quiet resilience and gentle humor. The legal proceedings against Margaret moved steadily forward, slowed occasionally by her attempts to delay through various legal maneuvers, though the evidence gathered by Edmund and confirmed through Nora's carefully preserved letters proved overwhelming. Harold Pierce, located eventually through persistent inquiry, confessed fully once confronted with the payment records tying him directly to the fabricated documents, unwilling to bear the full weight of the scandal alone. Society's judgment of Margaret proved swift and unforgiving. Families who had once eagerly sought her company at gatherings now turned away entirely, unwilling to associate themselves with a woman exposed so publicly for fraud and deception. Invitations ceased arriving at the Whitmore estate, and within a month, Margaret found herself increasingly isolated. Her carefully built social standing collapsed as thoroughly as the financial deception that had funded it. Clara and Violet, though initially tainted by association with their mother's scandal, gradually found their own paths forward. Clara, humbled considerably by the experience, began corresponding regularly with Elena, slowly rebuilding a relationship built on honesty rather than the strained politeness that had defined their years living under the same roof. Violet, gentler by nature, visited Ashworth Hall on several occasions, her friendship with Elena growing steadily warmer with each visit, unburdened now by their mother's watchful resentment. Margaret herself remained largely isolated at the Whitmore estate, her legal battles consuming much of her attention and resources. The court ultimately ruled decisively in Elena's favor, restoring her father's estate and fortune entirely to her name, along with additional compensation determined appropriate given the extent of the deception and the years of mistreatment Elena had endured under Margaret's care. The final hearing itself took place in a crowded courtroom in the county seat, packed with curious onlookers eager to witness the conclusion of a scandal that had consumed local conversation for months. Elena sat quietly beside Nathaniel throughout the proceedings, her hands folded tightly in her lap as the presiding magistrate reviewed the evidence one final time. Margaret sat across the room, flanked by a solicitor whose expression suggested he held little confidence in the outcome he had been hired to defend. She looked smaller somehow, Elena thought, watching her stepmother from across the crowded courtroom, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with her physical presence and everything to do with the collapse of the careful authority she had once wielded so completely. When Harold Pierce was called to testify, his confession delivered in a flat, resigned voice, Elena watched Margaret's composure finally crack entirely, her hands trembling visibly, as the full weight of the fabricated scheme was laid bare before the assembled court. Pierce described in careful detail the arrangement Margaret had proposed following her husband's death, the falsified debts, the forged signatures, the steady payments meant to ensure his continued silence. "I am not proud of what I did," Pierce admitted quietly, unable to meet Margaret's furious glare from across the room, "but I will not carry the weight of this deception alone any longer." The magistrate's ruling, delivered after a brief recess, was unambiguous. The fabricated debts were declared void entirely. The transfer of the Whitmore estate to Margaret's control ruled fraudulent and immediately reversed. Elena's inheritance, along with additional compensation calculated to reflect the years of financial harm and personal suffering she had endured, was restored to her completely. Margaret did not look at Elena as the ruling was read aloud. She stared instead at some fixed point on the courtroom floor, her expression unreadable, the last vestiges of her carefully constructed authority finally, publicly, stripped away entirely. Elena felt no triumph watching her stepmother's downfall, only a quiet, complicated relief. The culmination of years of suppressed grief and suspicion, finally resolved through the simple, undeniable weight of truth. She left the courtroom that afternoon with Nathaniel's steady hand at her back, stepping out into bright winter sunlight that felt, for the first time in years, entirely her own. Elena received the news of the court's final ruling on a quiet afternoon at Ashworth Hall, seated in the gardens with Nathaniel beside her, the same gardens where their careful courtship had first begun to bloom months earlier. "It is finished," she said softly, reading through the official letter Edmund had delivered that morning. "The estate is mine again, truly mine, beyond any question or dispute." "How does it feel?" Nathaniel asked gently, watching her carefully. Elena considered the question seriously. Memories of the past 3 years rising unbidden, the humiliation, the grief, the quiet desperation of feeling invisible in her own home. "Strange," she admitted finally. "I spent so long believing I deserved nothing more than what Margaret allowed me. Reclaiming everything feels almost unreal, as though I am waiting for someone to tell me it was all a mistake." "It is not a mistake," Nathaniel said firmly. "It is simply justice, finally delivered, however long it took to arrive." Elena smiled, though tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, relief and lingering grief mixing together, as they so often did these days. "I could not have reached this moment without you, Nathaniel. Without your persistence, your willingness to believe me when I barely believed myself. You give me far too much credit," he said quietly. "You survived years of cruelty with your dignity intact, long before I ever entered your life. I simply helped uncover the truth you already carried within yourself the entire time." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the warm afternoon sun filtering gently through the garden trees above them. Eventually, Nathaniel shifted slightly, reaching into his coat with careful deliberation. "I have been considering something," he said, his tone suddenly more serious than before. "For quite some time now, if I am honest." Elena turned toward him, curiosity and gentle affection mixing in her expression. "What is it?" "These past months," Nathaniel began, choosing his words carefully, "have shown me something I did not expect to find. Watching you navigate such profound betrayal with grace and quiet strength, I have rarely witnessed in anyone, let alone someone so young. I did not intend to fall in love with you, Elena. I certainly did not plan for it, given the circumstances under which we met, but I find myself entirely unable to imagine my future without you standing beside me within it." Elena's breath caught in her throat as Nathaniel lowered himself carefully onto one knee before her, producing a small velvet box from within his coat, opening it to reveal a delicate ring, simple yet elegant, catching the afternoon light softly. "Elena Whitmore," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind it. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not out of pity, nor obligation, but because I have never admired anyone as deeply as I admire you, nor wished so completely to spend my life beside someone." Tears spilled freely down Elena's cheeks now, joy overwhelming the last remaining traces of grief that had lingered since the confrontation weeks earlier. "Yes," she whispered, then repeated more firmly, laughter mixing with her tears. "Yes, Nathaniel, I would be honored." He slipped the ring gently onto her finger, rising to pull her into a warm, steady embrace, the culmination of months of careful courtship and shared vulnerability, finally reaching its natural conclusion. Nearby, Nora watched from a discreet distance, tears of her own gathering as she witnessed the moment she had hoped for since first helping Elena into her mother's gown all those months ago. News of the engagement spread quickly through society, met with widespread approval and genuine warmth, a stark contrast to the cold judgment that had once greeted Elena at her first, disastrous appearance among the county's elite. The young woman once humiliated publicly by her own stepmother was now celebrated as the Duke's chosen bride, her quiet strength and resilience becoming something of a quiet legend among those who had witnessed her transformation from overlooked stepdaughter to confident, deserving duchess. The wedding itself took place several months later, held in the very ballroom where Elena's fortunes had first begun to change so dramatically. The hall was filled with warm candlelight and genuine joy, guests gathering not out of social obligation, but out of true affection for the couple whose story had captured the county's imagination entirely. Clara and Violet attended, both dressed modestly, both genuinely joyful witnessing Elena's happiness despite the complicated history that had once separated them. Their relationship with Elena, while never quite what it might have been under different circumstances, had settled into something honest and cautiously warm, built slowly through consistent effort rather than the false politeness that had once defined their years together. Margaret did not attend. Her isolation had only deepened in the months following the scandal, her social standing entirely collapsed, her financial resources severely diminished by the legal proceedings and the settlement ultimately required to compensate Elena fully for years of fraudulent control. She lived now in a much smaller residence, far removed from the grand estate she had once ruled so tightly, her ambitions for her daughter's futures reduced to quiet, private hopes rather than the calculated schemes that had once defined her every action. Elena felt no satisfaction in her stepmother's downfall, only a quiet, resigned sadness for the years of pain that could have been avoided entirely, had Margaret chosen honesty and genuine care over deception and control. She had made peace, gradually, with the fact that some relationships could not be fully repaired, that Margaret's choices had consequences that extended far beyond what any apology could undo. Standing now at the altar beside Nathaniel, dressed in a gown far grander than the simple blue dress that had once carried her through her first, terrifying ball, Elena felt none of the fear and uncertainty that had once defined her existence within Margaret's household. She felt, instead, a quiet, steady confidence, the culmination of years of quiet endurance finally rewarded with genuine happiness and hard-won security. Nathaniel took her hands in his own as they exchanged their vows, his eyes steady and warm, carrying none of the guarded caution she remembered from their very first dance together. "I promise," he said softly, "to always see you clearly, Elena, exactly as you are, never as anyone else attempts to diminish you." "And I promise," Elena replied, her voice steady, despite the emotion swelling within her chest, "to never again allow fear to convince me that I do not deserve happiness, nor the love of someone who sees me so completely." As they were pronounced husband and wife, the assembled guests erupted into warm applause, the ballroom filling with genuine celebration, entirely unlike the cold judgment Elena had once faced within these very walls. Nora watched from among the guests, pride and quiet joy filling her weathered features as she witnessed the culmination of everything she had hoped for since first helping a frightened, grieving young woman reclaim her rightful place in the world. In the months and years that followed, Elena settled comfortably into her new life as Duchess of Ashworth, her quiet strength and genuine warmth earning her respect and admiration throughout the county, entirely on her own merit rather than any title or fortune alone. She used her position, and the wealth restored to her through her father's estate, to establish support for other young women facing similar hardship, ensuring that others who found themselves vulnerable to exploitation and deception had somewhere to turn for genuine help and protection. Nora remained close throughout, given a place of honor and comfort within Ashworth Hall for the remainder of her years, treated not as a servant, but as the family Elena had always considered her to be. Clara and Violet visited regularly, their relationship with Elena continuing to heal slowly, honestly, built now on genuine affection rather than the strained obligation of their earlier years together. And Elena, standing often in the very gardens where her courtship with Nathaniel had first blossomed, found herself frequently reflecting on the young woman she had once been, frightened and overlooked. Frightened, she deserved nothing more than the shadows Margaret had confined her to. That young woman had found, through quiet resilience and unexpected kindness, a strength she had never fully realized she possessed, a strength that had ultimately carried her from humiliation and betrayal into a life defined by genuine love, security, and the unwavering belief that she had always deserved far more than the world had once been willing to offer her. A year after their wedding, Elena stood once again in the gardens of Ashworth Hall, watching the late afternoon light stretch long and golden across the lawns her mother's flowers still bloomed along, carefully tended now by gardeners who understood exactly how much the small path meant to the household's duchess. Nathaniel found her there, as he often did, drawn by the same quiet peace she seemed to carry with her wherever she walked. "You are thinking of your father again," he observed gently, settling beside her on the small stone bench overlooking the pond. "I am," Elena admitted, smiling faintly. "I think of him often here. I believe he would have liked you, Nathaniel. He always said he wanted someone who would see me clearly, rather than simply see what I could offer them." "Then I hope I have lived up to that standard," Nathaniel said, taking her hand gently in his own. "You have," Elena said softly, resting her head against his shoulder as the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon. "Every single day, you have." They sat together in comfortable silence, the estate around them settled and peaceful, the scandal and struggle of years past, now a distant memory rather than an open wound. Nora's laughter drifted faintly from somewhere near the house, mixed with the sound of Clara's voice, visiting again for the week, her relationship with Elena continuing to strengthen with each passing season. The story of the stepdaughter humiliated publicly at a grand ball, only to find her hand taken instead by a duke who refused to let cruelty triumph, became something of a quiet legend throughout the county, told and retold for years afterward. But for Elena herself, it was never simply a story of triumph over cruelty, nor a simple tale of rescue by a powerful man. It was, instead, the story of her own quiet endurance finally being seen, recognized, and rewarded, a reminder that even in the darkest years of doubt and mistreatment, the truth of who she truly was had never fully disappeared, waiting patiently for the moment it would finally be allowed to shine. 3 years passed, and Ashworth Hall had grown into something Elena had never quite dared imagine during her years of quiet suffering beneath Margaret's roof. The halls that once belonged only to formal gatherings and careful political maneuvering now echoed with the sound of a child's laughter, a small girl named Rosalind, barely 2 years old, who had inherited her father's steady gray eyes and her mother's stubborn determination in equal measure. Elena watched her daughter chase after a wooden toy across the nursery floor, Nora seated nearby with careful, watchful patience, still very much a fixture of the household despite her advancing years. The old woman had refused every suggestion of retirement, insisting she still had purpose within these walls, particularly now that a new generation required her steady guidance. "She has your father's stubbornness," Nora observed fondly, watching Rosalind attempt, with fierce determination, to climb over a low ottoman rather than walk around it. "She has considerably more than that," Elena said, laughing softly, as she scooped her daughter up before the child could tumble entirely off balance. "Nathaniel insists she inherited his patience as well, though I confess I have yet to witness much evidence of it." Their life together had settled into something Elena had once believed impossible. A quiet, steady happiness built on honesty rather than fear, on partnership rather than survival. Nathaniel remained as devoted as he had been during their earliest courtship, though the responsibilities of managing both the dukedom and their growing family had added new dimensions to their relationship that neither had fully anticipated. Clara visited often during those years, her bond with Elena growing steadier with each season that passed. She had married a quiet, kind gentleman from a neighboring county the previous autumn, a match built on genuine affection rather than the calculated ambition that had once defined her mother's approach to such matters. Watching Clara find happiness on her own terms brought Elena a satisfaction she had not expected, proof that the cycle of fear and manipulation that had once defined their family could, with enough effort, finally be broken. Violet, too, had found her own quiet path forward, choosing to remain unmarried for the time being, instead devoting herself to charitable work among the county's poorer families, a calling Elena had gently encouraged and, in later years, helped fund through the estate's growing resources. The two sisters had become, against every early expectation, genuine friends to Elena, their shared history no longer a source of pain but a foundation for something more honest. On quiet mornings, Elena often walked the nursery halls before the household fully woke, watching sunlight spill gently across Rosalind's small sleeping form, marveling at how completely her life had transformed from the frightened uncertainty of her earliest years in this world. She had once believed happiness of this magnitude was reserved for other people, for daughters born into kinder circumstances than her own. Watching her own daughter grow surrounded by warmth and security instead of fear taught her, slowly and completely, that such happiness had always been within her reach, waiting only for the courage to claim it. It was during this settled, comfortable season of life that an unexpected letter arrived, addressed directly to Elena, in handwriting she recognized instantly, despite not having seen it in nearly 3 years. "Margaret." Elena sat with the sealed letter for a long while before opening it, memories and lingering uncertainty rising unbidden as she turned the paper over in her hands. She had heard little of her former stepmother since the trial's conclusion. Only occasional fragments passed along through Clara, who maintained a cautious, distant correspondence with her mother, despite the fractured nature of their relationship. When she finally opened the letter, she found Margaret's familiar handwriting, though noticeably less confident than she remembered, the words carrying a fragility that surprised her. "Elena, I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I believe I deserve it. I write only because illness has made me consider, more seriously than I ever allowed myself to before, the harm I caused you, and the family I nearly destroyed through my own selfishness and fear. I do not ask you to visit, nor to respond. I only wished you to know that I understand, finally and completely, exactly what I took from you, and I am sorry, more deeply than these simple words could ever properly convey. Margaret." Elena read the letter twice more before setting it carefully aside, complicated emotions settling heavily in her chest. She had made peace, largely, with the fact that her relationship with Margaret could never be fully repaired. Yet something in the letter's raw honesty stirred a compassion she had not expected to still carry after everything. She brought the letter to Nathaniel that evening, once Rosalind had been settled for the night, watching his expression carefully as he read through Margaret's careful words. "What will you do?" he asked gently, once he had finished reading. I do not know, Elena admitted honestly. Part of me wishes to simply set it aside, to protect the peace I have built here with you and Rosalind. But another part of me wonders if there is value in seeing her, if only to close a chapter that has remained painfully open for far too long. Whatever you decide, Nathaniel said, taking her hand gently. I will support you completely. This is your choice to make, Elena, not mine, nor anyone else's. Elena considered the matter carefully over the following days, weighing old grief against the quiet, unexpected compassion Margaret's letter had stirred within her. Eventually, she decided to visit, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to understand whether true remorse could exist alongside the deception Margaret had inflicted for so long. She traveled to the modest cottage where Margaret now lived, considerably diminished from the grand estate she had once ruled so completely. Margaret answered the door herself, no longer accompanied by servants or the trappings of wealth she had once commanded so carefully. She looked older than her years, illness having taken a visible toll on her once formidable presence. Elena, Margaret said softly, clearly startled by the unexpected visit. I did not think you would come. I did not think I would either, Elena admitted, stepping inside at Margaret's hesitant invitation. They sat together in Margaret's small, simply furnished sitting room, conversation halting and uncertain at first, though gradually, as the afternoon wore on, something resembling honest connection began to form between them, perhaps for the very first time in the years they had known each other. I have thought often, Margaret said quietly, about what drove me to such desperate choices. Fear, mostly. Fear that my daughters would be left with nothing, that I myself would be left dependent on the charity of others after your father's death. It does not excuse what I did to you, Elena. Nothing could excuse that. But I hope, in some small way, you might understand the fear that drove me to it. I understand fear, Elena said carefully. I lived with it for years beneath your care. But fear does not excuse cruelty, Margaret. It never has. No, Margaret agreed, tears gathering unexpectedly in her tired eyes. It does not. I only hope, someday, you might find enough peace to forgive me regardless, not for my sake, but for your own. Elena considered the words carefully, feeling the weight of years of pain settle gently, finally, into something closer to resolution than lingering anger. I forgive you, she said quietly, surprising herself with how genuinely she meant it, not because what you did was acceptable, but because I no longer wish to carry the burden of that anger any further. I have a family now, Margaret, a daughter of my own. I would rather teach her about grace than about grudges. Margaret wept openly then, years of guilt and isolation finally finding some measure of release in Elena's quiet, unexpected mercy. They spoke for another hour, carefully, honestly, before Elena finally departed, promising to write occasionally, though careful not to overextend a reconciliation still fragile and uncertain. She returned to Ashworth Hall that evening with a lightness she had not expected, the final threads of old grief finally settling into something resembling peace. Nathaniel greeted her at the entrance. Rosalind balanced comfortably on his hip, both waiting eagerly for her return. How was your visit? He asked gently, watching her carefully for any sign of renewed distress. Difficult, Elena admitted, taking Rosalind into her arms, pressing a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead. But necessary, I think. I forgave her, Nathaniel. Not because she deserved it, but because I finally understand that carrying that anger any longer would only continue punishing myself far more than it ever punished her. Nathaniel smiled softly, pride and quiet admiration clear in his expression. You continue to surprise me, even after all these years. I hope I always will, Elena said, laughing softly as Rosalind reached up to tug playfully at her hair. That evening, as the family settled together in the warm glow of the sitting room, Elena found herself reflecting once more on the long journey that had brought her to this moment, from a frightened, overlooked young woman hiding in the shadows of her own home, to a confident duchess, wife and mother, finally at peace with the past that had once threatened to define her entirely. The story that had once begun with public humiliation at a grand ball had grown into something far larger than she could have imagined that fearful night. A story of resilience, justice, and ultimately, the quiet, hard-won grace to release old pain and build something entirely new from its ashes. Whatever challenges still awaited her in the years ahead, Elena understood now, with complete certainty, that she possessed the strength to meet them, not because a duke had rescued her from her circumstances, but because she had never truly stopped fighting for herself, even in her darkest, most invisible years. And as she watched her daughter drift slowly towards sleep in her arms, surrounded by the warmth of a family built on honesty rather than deception, Elena finally allowed herself to believe, completely and without reservation, that she had found exactly where she was always meant to belong.